There is a particular quality to objects that disappear without explanation. They do not leave behind complaints, investigations, or front-page columns. They simply cease to be made. And the world adjusts around their absence so naturally that within a generation, the absence itself begins to seem inevitable, as though the thing had always been destined to end, as though the ending were caused by something clean and understood. American silvered glass is one of those objects, and the story attached to its disappearance is one of those explanations that sounds authoritative until you go looking for the documents that should underpin it. The American silvered glass industry was a genuinely sophisticated enterprise. It emerged in the early 1850s, concentrated almost entirely in Massachusetts, in a cluster of glassworks that had for decades made New England the center of American decorative glass production. The Boston and Sandwich Glass Company, the New England Glass Company, the Boston Silver Glass Company, the Union Glass Company, these were not small operations working in the dark. They were established manufacturers with distribution networks, commercial catalogs, and reputations built over years of skilled production. When silvered glass became fashionable in mid-century American households, these companies were already positioned to supply it. They moved into production with the infrastructure of an industry that knew how glass worked. The product itself was a technical achievement. A double-walled glass vessel, a vase, a candlestick, a beaded ball meant for a windowsill, was manufactured with a cavity between its two glass layers. Into that cavity went the silvering agent, which produced the mirrored, luminous interior surface that made these objects remarkable. They caught light differently than any other decorative glass. They held their brightness in low rooms. They had a visual quality that plain glass or painted ceramic could not replicate, and American consumers in the 1850s and 1860s bought them in considerable quantity. The name that would follow this product into the 20th century, Mercury glass, is largely inaccurate. The process that defined industrial silvered glass production was not a mercury process. It was the silver nitrate reduction method developed by the German chemist Justus von Liebig, first demonstrated in 1835 and refined through subsequent work into a practical industrial technique by 1856. The Liebig process introduced a solution of silver nitrate into the interior of the double-walled vessel, where a reducing agent caused the silver to precipitate out of solution and adhere to the inner glass surface as a thin, bright, reflective layer. It was chemistry, not alchemy, and it was silver, not mercury. The term mercury glass persisted, likely because of earlier decorative mirror-making traditions that had used tin mercury amalgam, and because the name carried an exotic, slightly dangerous sound that suited a product meant to feel special. But in the American glassworks of Massachusetts, the dominant method was Liebig's silver chemistry. The workers were handling silver nitrate solutions, not liquid mercury. That distinction matters enormously to what comes later. By the late 1860s and through the 1870s, American silvered glass production was at its peak commercial maturity. The companies were experienced, the technique was understood, and the market was established. These were not experimental workshops hedging their bets on an uncertain product. They had refined their methods across 2 decades. The glassware they produced was entering homes across the northeastern United States as a known and desired commodity. There is no evidence from this period, no trade journal complaint, no manufacturer's correspondence that has surfaced, no industry association report suggesting that the silvered glass business was struggling with technical failure, rising costs that could not be absorbed, or any difficulty specific to the silvering process itself. And yet, by circa 1880, the production of high-quality silvered glass in the United States had effectively ended. Not wound down gradually, not legislated away, not shuttered in the wake of scandal or disaster. It stopped. The companies that had made these objects either ceased producing them or ceased operating in the forms they had taken. The New England silvered glass industry, which had been a functioning commercial enterprise through most of the 1870s, was gone from the market before the decade closed. Look for the reason in the contemporary record, and you encounter a silence that is itself significant. There was no public safety campaign against silvered glass production in the years around 1880. No newspaper from 1875 to 1885 has yielded accounts of public outcry against the manufacture of these objects. No regulatory action was taken at the state or federal level to curtail or prohibit their production. No civic organization published pamphlets. No political figure spoke against the industry. The apparatus that would normally attend a safety-driven industrial shutdown, the agitation, the journalism, the legislative hearings, the official record is simply absent. Whatever ended the American silvered glass industry, the contemporary record does not record it as a safety event. This is worth holding against a comparison. Mercury was genuinely present in American industry throughout this entire period, and in at least one major application it was being used in ways that were demonstrably harmful to workers. The hat-making industry had for generations used mercuric nitrate to cure animal felt, to make the felt fibers interlock in a way that produced a durable hat with a smooth finish. The neurological damage this caused to hatters was understood, at least informally, in the trade. The phrase "mad" as a hatter did not arise without reference. France would ban mercuric nitrate in hat-making in 1898. Britain would require reporting of mercury-related industrial illness in 1895. The United States would not prohibit the practice until 1941. Throughout the 1870s, 1880s, and well beyond, American hatters were working with actual mercury compounds in conditions that harmed them, and this industry was not shut down. It continued operating. The regulatory apparatus that did not intervene in silvered glass production also did not intervene in hat making, which was genuinely more hazardous, but the hat making industry continued, and the silvered glass industry did not. If the end of American silvered glass production was a safety-driven event, then it would represent the only known case in this period of an American manufacturing industry being effectively terminated by safety concerns that left no contemporary record of those concerns, while a demonstrably more hazardous adjacent industry continued without interruption. That is not an impossible coincidence, but it is an unusual one. And unusual coincidences, in documentary history, deserve scrutiny before acceptance. What was happening in the American market for decorative glass around 1880 was a commercial shift. German glassware was arriving in growing quantities. The price points were competitive, the product lines were expanding. A particular kind of buyer, the one who might previously have purchased an American-made silvered glass ornament or vase, was finding German alternatives on American shelves. The economics of the transition were real and measurable. The safety story attached to that transition is not traceable to the period when the transition actually occurred. It appears later, in retrospective accounts, and by the time it appears the industry it describes has been gone long enough that there is no one left to dispute the framing. The silence in the record around 1880 is not absence of history, it is history. Something ended the American silvered glass industry. The contemporary record of what ended it is a commercial record. It is not a safety record, and the gap between those two records is where this story actually lives. The town of Lauscha sits in the Thuringian forest, in a region of Germany that has been working glass since 1597. It is not a large place, and it was never a large place, but by the middle of the 19th century it had developed a level of technical glass expertise that was the product of centuries of accumulated craft knowledge, passed through families and workshops in a community that did very little besides make glass. The relationship between Lauscha and its craft was not simply occupational, it was structural. The town's economy, its social organization, its sense of itself, all of it was built around the glassblower's pipe and the flame. When a new technique arrived, Lauscha absorbed it not as an industrial pivot, but as an extension of what the town already knew how to do. The Lauscha Glassanstalt was established in 1867, and it was through this institution and the network of small workshops surrounding it that silvering techniques were introduced to Lauscha's ornament production. The timing is worth noting. The American silvered glass industry was at roughly its commercial peak in the late 1860s, its technique mature and its market established. Lauscha, in 1867, was beginning to apply the same family of techniques, the silver nitrate reduction chemistry, that Liebig had developed to a product line that American manufacturers had not prioritized: the small, decorative, holiday ornament. Where American makers had focused on vases, candle holders, and decorative spheres for year-round household use, Lauscha's glassblowers were working at a smaller scale, producing intricate shapes, fruits, birds, figures, balls of elaborate surface texture that were explicitly seasonal, explicitly gift-oriented, and priced for a mass market that did not yet exist in fully formed shape, but was beginning to be visible on the horizon. F.W. Woolworth found that horizon in 1880. The details of what happened in his Lancaster, Pennsylvania store that year have passed into retail history with the quality of an origin myth. And origin myths in commercial history always deserve scrutiny, but the core of this one is documented. Woolworth stocked 144 Lauscha ornaments. He sold them in a single day. The speed of that sell-through was not lost on him. He was a merchant whose entire operational philosophy was built on understanding what moved quickly and then moving more of it, and 144 ornaments selling in a day in a single store told him something specific about the relationship between German decorative glass, the American Christmas market, and the price point at which that market would open. By 1890, the trade he built on that discovery had grown to millions of ornaments imported annually. The F.W. Woolworth Archive, held at the University of Reading in the United Kingdom, contains the administrative and purchasing records through which this relationship can be traced. The growth curve that those records document is not the growth curve of a niche import business finding a small audience. It is the growth curve of a market being defined. Woolworth was not supplying an existing mass demand for German Christmas ornaments. He was creating the conditions under which that demand could exist, and then consistently reinforcing them, stocking the product, pricing it accessibly, placing it where the right customers would encounter it. The Lauscha glassblowers, working in their small family workshops in the Thuringian forest, were producing for a market they had never seen, in quantities that expanded year over year, because a Pennsylvania merchant had decided that their product was the right object for a particular American cultural moment. The McKinley Tariff Act passed on the 1st of October, 1890. It applied 60% ad valorem duties to decorated, silvered, and cut glass imported into the United States. This was not a favorable arrangement for Lauscha. A 60% duty on the import price of an ornament is a significant addition to the cost of that ornament, and there is a version of this story in which the McKinley tariff could have functioned as a protective measure for domestic glass production had there been a domestic silvered ornament industry to protect. There was not. The American silvered glass industry was already gone. The tariff raised the cost of German ornaments without creating an American alternative to substitute for them, because no American manufacturer had built the production infrastructure necessary to make the small, intricate, silver-plated ornament in the volumes that the market now demanded. The duties were absorbed. Woolworth continued importing. Consumer demand for the product had reached a scale by 1890 at which a 60% tariff was an inconvenience rather than a prohibition, because the underlying price of the Lauscha ornament was low enough and the appetite for it was strong enough that the final shelf price remained within reach of the buyers Woolworth had spent a decade cultivating. This is the structure of a completed displacement. The American silvered glass industry ended around 1880. The German import trade, anchored by the Woolworth relationship, grew through the 1880s and survived the McKinley tariff of 1890 because the displacement had already occurred. There was no American industry left to be protected. The tariff came after the transition, not before it, and it applied to a market that had already organized itself around an imported supply. What came later, and this is the critical point, was a story, not a fabrication, exactly, but a narrative construction that assigned a cause to the end of the American industry. The cause assigned was safety. The silvering process, this account suggested, had been hazardous to produce. The use of mercury, and here the misnomer does real work, because the word mercury is doing the explanatory labor that the word silver could not do, had made the industry untenable. The implication was that American manufacturers had stopped making silvered glass because it was unsafe to make, that this was the natural, perhaps inevitable, end of a process that used a dangerous substance. The problem with this account is not that it is entirely invented, it is that it cannot be anchored to the period it claims to describe. The safety narrative attached to the end of American silvered glass production does not trace back to sources from 1875 to 1885. It does not trace back to the newspaper archives of those years, which contain no safety panic around the product. It does not trace back to regulatory proceedings, because there were none. It does not trace back to manufacturer accounts or trade press, because those accounts do not frame the industry's end in safety terms. The safety story appears in retrospective tellings assembled at a distance from the events, and by the time it was assembled, the documentary record was thin enough that the story could fill the space without immediate contradiction. What the retrospective safety narrative accomplishes, whether or not this was its intention, is the removal of commercial causation from the account. If American silvered glass ended because it was dangerous to make, then it ended because it had to. The timing of its end coinciding precisely with the maturation of the German import trade and the beginning of the Woolworth ornament business becomes incidental rather than explanatory. The German industry did not displace the American one. The American one simply became untenable on its own terms. The transition looks like necessity rather than competition. The displacement looks like natural obsolescence rather than commercial defeat. But the hat-making industry was still processing felt with mercuric nitrate through the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, and beyond, and no one was telling that story as the inevitable end of an unsafe practice. That industry continued until it was actively prohibited, decades later. The American silvered glass industry ended without prohibition, without campaign, without any of the apparatus by which unsafe industries are actually terminated. It ended at the moment when German production was ready to supply what American production had been supplying, and when a single American merchant had discovered that there was a market for German ornamental glass that could be built at scale. The record of what ended American Mercury glass is not a safety record, it is a commercial record. Someone decided those two things should not be distinguished.